The following is an interview with Rex Parker, director of the Amateur Astronomers Association of Princeton. It was recorded at his home observatory in the summer of 2020. Tell us a little bit about how long it took you to get set up and what maybe some of the biggest challenges were.
In beginning to consider how to get a little bit better at this art or this craft of doing astrophotography and the scientific aspects of it, the technical aspects, the artisan-like aspects of it all sort of come together. And it was a recognition that the ability to do it at a higher level really required more of a permanent setup, and hence the idea of an observatory. And so that idea took many years to blossom. I think it was aspirational, like many of us have aspirations of what we're going to do in the future, but it takes a long time to get there. So for me, it certainly took decades to get there. In the period around 2010-12, I started getting serious about how would one approach building an observatory suitable for the gardens, for the backyard. And we have a place that has all kinds of wildlife and flowers and trees, but also has a very nice open southern sky. So I had the idea of a location not too far from the house, something that needed to be aesthetic and fit into the garden setting, and that really for me meant a roll-off roof wooden style observatory that could be built with a little bit of sort of architectural flair rather than a dome observatory, which is also a very nice thought, but it didn't quite mesh with the surroundings here. And my wife in particular had some strong opinions to it, and that led to her actually finding a company, gardensheds.com, which is a purveyor, a manufacturer locally, it turns out, of very high-end garden sheds and the like that you find around pool settings and so forth. And as it turned out, the owner of this company lives only about 15 miles from here in Hunterdon County, and I approached him about the prospect of building a roll-off roof observatory based on architectural designs he had already created for some of his other work. I should mention it was my wife who found that Garden Sheds hit by looking through one of her fine gardening magazines, which is kind of a cute thing. Anyway, one thing led to another. We started getting serious about building plans, drafting plans, and he was an architect. And this led to the design that we are standing in front of right now. So the idea of a roll-off roof observatory built to specifications to house the instrument of choice on a pedestal of required specification and amount of a certain size, and those physical dimensions were a big part of the planning process. Of course, the astronomy side of it, the actual hardware, what the telescope was going to be, what the camera was going to be, what the mount was going to be, were serious considerations in all of that, and we can talk a little bit more about that in a minute.
Now, Rex, you have this beautiful observatory here in your backyard in Titusville. What would you recommend, though, as a starter kit for an astrophotographer? And maybe give us a rough idea of kind of what we're talking about in terms of the magnitude of investment and cost to get started in astrophotography.
Well, keeping in mind that the goal is to have fun. I mean, it is scientific, but really, let's face it, this is a hobby. We're trying to get enjoyment and understand at the same time. And so I think that if you have a telescope already, use the telescope that you own, use the mount that you have. Having said that, there's minimal sort of requirements to get this to really work well. So you don't want to go too high here. You want to start with something that's relatively light and relatively simple. So you do need a tracking mount. That's like a fundamental requirement. So it does not need to be a go-to mount. In fact, I have inside the observatory here a portable mount that is literally an early 1990s model from Vixen that is sold with a number of Celestron telescopes. It's in great shape, but it's just an old German equatorial mount, and it has a simple clock drive that's geared to the RA axis, so it'll track the sky, but it has no go-to capabilities. It doesn't even have a motor on the other axis, the declination axis. And yet, with the field of view that you can get with a camera, modest focal length telescope, let's say somewhere between 600 to 900, even 1,000 millimeter focal length scope, you can find things adequately with a finder and use a video camera that I'll suggest a couple, but the types of cameras that we really need are CCD or CMOS cameras that are really designed for astrophotography. And that's not to say you can't use a really nice DSLR that you may be using already for terrestrial purposes, and certainly you can go that route. If you have one, it may be the best way to go if you have a really good sensor on them. But I think that everybody's aware that most terrestrial cameras have filters that really block some of the incoming astronomical light, and you probably don't want to mess around with having it defiltered if you're going to use it for terrestrial stuff. So my recommendation would be go with something lightweight, something relatively modest, like several $100s, not necessarily $1,000. I'm going to show you one that maybe is a little bit on the extreme end of that. This is about a $1,000 camera. This is a Starlight Express camera. Look how small this is. It's really eyepiece size. It's about 3 inches long. I'm going to take the filter off. It has an ultraviolet and infrared filter. Just helps with the color balancing a little bit. Maybe you can even see the sensor size inside that. So this goes in the eyepiece holder of your telescope, and with that, a USB connection to a laptop. It doesn't take a super laptop at all, just whatever laptop you're using for your Zoom conferencing probably works here. And the power draw for a camera like this literally runs off of the laptop battery. You don't even need an external power source. Of course, you will need an external battery for your clock drive or your tracking mount. So let's say you have a small reflector or a small refractor set up in the field. You've got a finder scope and you've got the finder aligned with the telescope. You can actually find things and get them centered on the camera and start visualizing these things with a type of software that we call, let's call it EAA. We use that term in the club, Electronically Assisted Astronomy. Starlight Express makes one called Starlight Live. There's another one called SharpCap that ZWO is making. I think ZWO has come out with some other software, ZWO Capture, and we're finding that you can do video astronomy, not necessarily deep sky captures of images, but rather a form of video astronomy where now the exposure length may be 5 seconds, maybe 6, 10 seconds, no longer than that. And you're stacking these images in the software in live, in real time. And it's a form of video applied to astronomy. I highly recommend this as a way to start because it really breaks you in and you start understanding how cameras work, how the software works, what an image looks like. Not to say that you cannot save those images, because you can, and that would be your portal into deciding to go longer in exposure and deeper into the sky, which is what this heavy-duty equipment behind me is really designed to do. This little camera, the Starlight Express Ultra Star Color, is about $900. There are some equivalent models, and I and a number of members of the club have recently come to appreciate the value of the latest generation of CMOS sensor-based cameras. So you can look this up. I think people are generally aware CCD and CMOS is the nature of the sensor, how it's been designed. CMOS does have some advantages, and I'm finding, for example, the company ZWO Optical, and they're a Chinese company. Starlight Express is a British company. Certainly there are a lot of other companies that I would highly recommend, but I want to point out that you want to stay lightweight, you want to stay modest in scale. You want the image, you want the sensor size to be matched to your optics, which is actually a detailed subject we can talk a little bit more about, but do not make the mistake of buying a really large frame, a large sensor, heavy camera that creates all sorts of difficulties out in the field when you're trying to balance things and really get your mount to track well. I should mention there are a couple of newer generation tracking mounts that we could recommend here. Ioptron makes something called an AVX mount, which is a German equatorial. It does a really great job of tracking in a portable tripod setup and relatively easy to polar align that telescope using the software and internal hardware of the scope. Another one is Ioptron's AZ Mount Pro, which is also something the club has a version of, and some members also own one. The Ioptron AZ Mount Pro has the advantage of not requiring polar alignment of any kind. It actually self-aligns. It's an alt-az style, altitude azimuth controlled mount rather than an equatorial mount. But for EAA application, for this video astronomy with small cameras, it's working very well to basically track accurately enough to allow imaging through this EAA technique. And again, those mounts may be on the order of a little over $1,000. You can actually pick them up used, and I should mention a great resource out there. Some of you are probably familiar with, and there's other ones, but the one I like very much is Astromart. and it's run by one of the major astronomy stores out on the West Coast. I think it's Woodland Hills Camera. But Astromart is the online swapping shopping place for used astronomy equipment, and it has a long history. It has a very secure platform. I've had great success moving and acquiring high quality used equipment through Astromart. There's no reason to necessarily pay top dollar for any of the hardware here in my hand, around me here, although much of it was new, much of it was also used. And I think amateur astronomers have a pretty high code of ethics in terms of reselling used equipment on Astromart. I would recommend you take a look at that.
Rex, you mentioned the ZWO series of cameras. There's a broad array of cameras and options available, and you mentioned matching your camera to your scope in weight and sensor size and the like. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about how one decides on how to match up scope with the camera?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to consider there, and it is a little difficult to confront all the details of it. It's difficult to talk about it, in fact, without having charts and diagrams in front of you. But for example, this little camera, which I said costs about, I need to put this down, sorry, costs about $1,000, maybe a little bit less. You can maybe get it for $750 on Astromart. You see the size of that sensor. It's about 10 centimeters by, even less than that, 9 centimeters by 13 centimeters. The pixel size is something like 6 micrometers. And both of those points are what you want to pay attention to. The size of the pixel, basically the micrometer dimensions of the pixels, the number of pixels, but really more than the number of pixels, the full frame size of the sensor, literally the physical X and Y dimensions of the sensor, and matching that size to the illuminated circle that's coming through your telescope optics. So when you have a relatively short focal length scope, like a 600, 800, 1,000 millimeter refractor, maybe a 5-inch reflector, you're going to have an illuminated circle on the order of about maybe 15 millimeters in diameter. And as you go out beyond that, what you'll find is an optical property of vignetting, where the light intensity falls off. Further, you have certain types of aberrations due to the optics. Depending on the quality of the optical design, you can have types of aberrations, basically curvature of the field. And field curvature means that some of the stars are going to be oblong or out of focus, or you'll have coma. You'll have a variety of optical defects. The larger the sensor, the more you're picking those up, because they lie off of the central axis. So if you keep your sensor small enough that it's mostly on the central axis of the telescope, then those effects are going to be minimized. You're going to be a lot happier result. You're going to be a lot happier with your result. At the same time, the smaller the sensor, the narrower the field of view, and the harder it is to put an object onto it when you're moving the telescope around the sky. Those two things sort of balance each other out. And I think that if you buy a camera with the dimensions something like 9 by 14, 10 by 15, not much larger than that, you're going to be happier as an entry level, or even your second camera. You don't really need to go bigger than that until you get up to an optical system like we have inside here. Pixel size is an important consideration, but really there's some limits on what are even available just because of CCD and CMOS technology. You see some cameras with the pixels are as small as 3.5 micrometers. I personally stay away from those. They tend to have less of a dynamic response because those tiny wells fill up with photons faster, if you will. Their full well capacity is less. If you're in the neighborhood of 5 to 6 micrometer dimension pixels, then you're going to have a greater well depth, and that's going to give the camera better dynamic range. We could talk about in a minute some other aspects, like the full color sensor versus the RGB filter method. That's sort of another level of discussion here.
I guess with observatory and with astronomers, you're never really done when you're with all your gear. There's always something else maybe on the on the list that you'd love to pick up. What gear are you considering adding to your observatory, and what would they add to your interest?
Well, this will sound funny, but I'm probably where I need to be. I'm at a sweet spot, so I'm really spending my time utilizing the equipment I have, and I think I can go many, many years with the hardware I have. Having said that, I did just upgrade a camera just last summer. I bought a new CMOS color APS-C size camera, a ZWO brand. Some of you are familiar with that, and this has been a great advance for me in terms of how well it meshes with the sky conditions we have here in New Jersey. So I really think that other than portable stuff, things for outreach, small scopes and small tripods, some of which are standing behind me inside the door here, those might be in the future. But really at this level, I have what I need to equip this place. That's not to say that one can't go deeper and higher. And to do that, my ambition has been to go outside, and I've had some experiences at some professional observatories I've been fortunate enough to get access to in Chile as well as in Mount Lemmon, Arizona. We could also talk about later. But I think, we're set here. We're in good shape here. And now it's all about finding the time to utilize the equipment that we have.
I will add that Rex said that without his wife observing his comments, so it must be true. This has been an interview with Rex Parker, Director of the Amateur Astronomers Association of Princeton, and produced by member Rich Sherman. Founded in 1962, the Amateur Astronomers Association of Princeton is a non-profit organization that promotes a wide range of astronomy-related activities, including solar, planetary, and deep sky observing, astrophotography, star parties, lectures, and education. The group owns and operates its observatory at Washington Crossing State Park in New Jersey. For more information about the club and its outreach activities, please visit www.princetonastronomy.org.